Okay, we all like looking at archaeology, especially in ancient Egypt, but I'm going to show you something here correlating people who've been back 30,000 years ago and even 70,000 years ago in this video here. And so we'll look at Egyptian timelines that are well before any of these places that we well know as Egypt. 30,000 years predates any Egyptian civilization by some over 20,000 years, and that's if we go with the mythology of ancient Egypt and how they come about. You can see this man here. I don't know why his chin beard's knocked off. Perhaps that was done during construction, but you can tell his phenotype here of the ancient Egyptians. We've talked about that, and I'll look at that again here shortly. But what we're going to look at here is a guy known as Nazlet Khater, and he was found somewhere near the temple of Dendera that I talked about recently when we talked about the earliest zodiacs known in the world. So this is something that far reaches back beyond the Egyptians that we know. Of course, if you look up here, you actually will see a man with a reddish type hair, a second from the right, and a few more down to the left, one with blonde or yellow ochre type of hair and so on. And so there are many of people that had that genetics in ancient Egypt. And I've shown quite a few times that even archaeology has pinpointed out that those were the people that were ruling it whenever they built the pyramids. And though there was Middle Kingdom and things that went on, and a few times that it all fell apart, and the intermediate periods, they also mention that it comes back to its previous power roundabout in the New Kingdom area through the times of Akhenaten, King Tut, and then through to Ramses the Great and Seti and all of those, and made connections. We'll look at that here later though. So this is a presentation that was put together by a girl known as Kemet Queen, and she started gathering ground whenever they tried to put out an ancient Queen Cleopatra, which was supposedly a documentary, and tried to put somehow Bantu people in that. Well, we all know how that comes about, but here's a good picture of her, and you can see that her right eye, the one on the left, is done in a way that's very reminiscent of Egyptologist 7 and her moniker that's done there. There's a gorgeous girl here, and she lives in Egypt and so on, and I take pride, or she takes pride in defending ancient Egypt, and I like that a lot too, and have pride in that moment too, although I'll show you something that makes a little different connection here shortly, but we don't want to go through that now necessarily. So we're looking at the earliest times of civilization, or anybody being in Egypt, and this is well before any of these statues that we're looking at now and so on were created. One can easily tell the phenotype here, and of course if they find the nose broken off, they try to make all kinds of claims, but we can see how this nose fit right back onto where it goes, and then you can easily tell that that's just a farce they're trying to take, and if they could find the nose knocked off, they try to pretend that it would have had a Negroid type nose that really was unknown in ancient Egypt. Nubians weren't even allowed into Egypt by well-known decrees, but we're going again 30,000 years BC and well before any of this time that we're talking about here. The Neolithic era that comes on here, and these people that were here all across North Africa and into Egypt, and during a time whenever actually the Sahara was green, and I've done other videos about it. In fact, I've got a video that I always point out called Mermaids of the Green Sahara, because they have cave drawings of mermaid people swimming around with whales. One of the whales is white. Is that Moby Dick and the whole concept coming out there? Well, perhaps, but what it does show is mermaid type people. So when we talk about mermaids being perhaps a Dutch type thing that they had made up with the Little Mermaid, it's something that goes well back. In my other videos I show you Dogon and Awanas and these people that had fishtails. So there's a connection there. But what we're looking at today is going way back in the Paleolithic. Now this place that we're looking at today is Nazlet Khater. It's shown here. And it's along the Nile, about midway, if you'd say, of the ancient territory of them. But again, this is 30,000 BC, so nowhere really that should be connected to it somehow. But this is also going to show you that there are caucasoid type people around then, because it's already been proven they were caucasoid type people whenever they left Egypt, or when they left Africa and went across that little isthmus up there and went into the Middle East and so on of that. Of course, after that point, there was a mixing with Neanderthals to a small extent. A lot of people have some 2 to 4% Neanderthal DNA back in them. And then that actually came back into North Africa and blended across all the people that were there. So they did go in and out. And by the way, this wasn't a one-time journey or trip. Well, here's a depiction of the way that he looks. This was repatriated from the people that got it back to Egypt to put in the new Cairo museum that they have there after repeated askings and stuff. And there's been some of that go on. We don't want it all to go on, definitely, because that's how people get interested in wanting to go see Egypt, is by seeing it in a museum. And instead of wanting to look at 100 articles or something, they want to see something more grandiose. It's pretty much what tempts at least half, 2/3 of the people that go to Egypt, which is based on tourism now. So let's take a look at what this guy kind of... We can see a man that's somewhat Cro-Magnon typed, Maghreb typed, Mectoid type, or so on, that are found not too much different in time than this. And this man that's here was shown to be extremely strong and worked his life apparently in mines that they had to find the best stones, crystals, and things like that to do their workmanship at the time. This is well before any metals and things like that. You can tell this man's somewhat phenotype that's shown here, although I believe they made it a little bit ambiguous towards it. And so this earliest of burials here was 35,000 years ago in Nazlet Khater province in Egypt. And it's one of the most important areas of that period, and the site of one of the earliest underground mining complexes in the world. This is where he worked, lived, and died, and he was just somewhere in his mid-20s to late 20s whenever he passed away. I'll show that to you in a minute. But this area that was found here is up on a type of mound, and it had a conspicuous shape to it somewhat. So archaeologists decided to start digging it out, and whenever they did, they found it was an ancient mining type thing. But whenever they got deeper into it, they found that there's this caveman that's here. So this predates Egypt. We're not looking at Egypt. We're looking at pre-proto-Egypt, if you will. So these holes that were down here and dug and everything, and there's been papers put out about it. They say that he was an extremely hard-working man, and they say that by in here talking about the infracranial remains, strong, muscular, insurgent. Some bones display characteristics that can be associated with retained archaic features, like the small developed styloid process of the ulna, marked angle between the neck and the shaft radius, and things like that too. So again, this is a caveman. And what they appeared to be looking for were flintstones. I don't know if you've ever watched the cartoon, The Flintstones, but the people in the time of the Flintstones really were more advanced than you think, somewhat like the Flintstones show off. But this man was extremely strong. He had, through his back and everywhere, all of these indications that he was kind of buff, although a skeleton will never show that. Some of the markings of the skeletons will. So, and here's his skeleton that's shown here, and the recreation that was shown before off of what a skull looked like. So he worked in these mines, and they would dig holes in the ground, And those holes would go deeper than a man, over 2 meters, if you will, until they found a strain, and then they would start digging sideways to find more of it. Much like whenever you dig down and find a gold vein and then try to follow it. But at this time, they don't even appear to be collected all in the ideas of gold and things, but what they're looking for is flint and chert and perhaps minerals in a mining situation that again is over 30,000 years ago. So pretty interesting. And they can see these shafts that are run down here, so they can create underground tunnels or chambers to end up mining in this. And the people that are depicted here look pretty correct. The guy on the right almost looks just like Nazlet Khater man himself. And they said that he probably passed away due to heat exhaustion, overworking. It didn't look like it had collapsed in on him or anything that they could tell, and if it did, and then they took him out, cleaned that out, and kept going working for him, you'd probably never notice it actually. So these pits were 9 meters square, so there are quite a few large deposits that were found there, and apparently once they found them, they started mining in that area, much like you would in any other situation. But at this time, they were excavated out by using like deer type horns, bones, and things like that. Again, this is before the Copper Age, or Chalcolithic as we call it, or especially the Bronze Age, and then the Iron Age that comes on after, and so on. So these people were using these as digging elements. And here you can see some needles that have been found in here, select pieces of chert and flint that have been worked and so on, that are associated with these same people during this same time in this same area. So also here we see there are a lot of those ivory combs and so on, but that is much later. These are tools of later Egyptians using in the earliest dynastic and pre-dynastic times, showing these combs here, which blacks always try to claim. Whenever I was a kid, they had afro picks that looked somewhat like this. Of course, that was a new and plastic thing that was going on there and not related to anything in ancient times. We've seen Viking combs, actually combs all across the Middle East, around the whole Mediterranean, up through Europe, that have this exact same look, although they may not have a hippopotamus like that one does on the top of it. Even made out of ivory and so on too. So we should be able to easily make connections to what type of people these were. But the archaeology and finding the actual skeleton is really more quite telling than even looking at anything like this. So they were digging in these caves. They were using red ochre for painting and things like this. And that's not found just in Egypt or in caves all around the place, but actually seen all the way through Europe and places. And I've shown you very many different caves. At one time I thought I was doing a little too much spelunking for y'all to enjoy, and thought I would take a break from it, came back to it, took a break from it, came back to it, took a break from it, came back to it. And I still tell you that there are at least 20 or 30 sites that are significant enough to make a video on at this point left. So in the paper here, they claim that they were somewhere between 20 and 29 years of age, according to the Blaze theorem and so, and that does give a little bit of a leeway to how this person was. Of course, whenever they're talking about it here in the paper, they're talking about the others that were found too. And basically, a lot of these people were between 20 and 29 years of old. Perhaps they learned mining, which we'll find out about later in the video, or in part 2 perhaps. But in this ideal, after a while, they started becoming the miners looking for the riches that they were always trying to seek. Now, his skeleton was found in 1980 by a Belgian explorer who, again, looked on that hill there, and he goes, this is kind of conspicuous, let's do a couple of test digs. And they found something. As soon as they did, they tried to dig them out, and in the process they found this, which got shipped off to Belgium. But here recently, due to the Cairo Museum being built, and they keep asking for all the artifacts to be brought back, which I think anybody in their right mind realizes that That shouldn't be done. Museums are there for a reason. All of this stuff was paid for and all kinds of things. A lot of the economy of Egypt was held up by it and is still held up by tourism. And a lot of what draws tourism is people seeing it in a museum and saying, honey, why don't we go there next year for our holiday? Let's take a Nile cruise. Let's see what Egypt has to offer. So again, these were taken back in 2004. And he came back and was brought with his axe. By the way, he was buried with an axe that was next to his head, and this looks like one of the earliest funerals in what we now call Egypt area, North Africa, that actually have burial gifts that are associated with it. Something that people think of having to have in the happy hunting grounds or the afterlife. So he's now in the National Museum of Egypt Civilization in Fustat, Cairo, in the new exhibit and the new stuff that's here. And here it is shown here with other associated artifacts, hand axes, worked chert, flint, stone, things like that. And he's almost complete too. It's not a partial, but near complete skeleton. So this man died while mining in ancient Egypt, well before anybody ever started the word Egypt or Kemet or anything like that. And some of the axes that are shown later, which you can see done and made out of flint, and their mapping techniques, the bottom of which looks just like the ones that we found that are associated with the time of Narmer and so on. In fact, the Gib el-Arak knife, which looks like it's made out of a blade very similar to the one on the bottom that's been extra napped like this, shows a master of beasts of the ancient Sumerians and a lot of other iconography. And at one time, I had to go around and flip myself through all kinds of photographs to show you these things and collect it. But nowadays they actually have it well documented out. And instead of having to see just one little paragraph, whenever you look at ancient Egypt, there's a whole wiki article on just the Sumerian and Egyptian connections. So at this same time, I have to mention there were people in Africa that were still a Homo erectus form, and there was no lithicness going on. In fact, this is a picture showing where they found some burnt stuff or whatever and tried to say, well, some of these people from time to time, maybe not always, actually were utilizing fire, which is far from the technological level of these people that we're looking at here, much less the pyramid builders much later. And here's another depiction of Nazlet Khater man done by ancestralwhispers.org, showing the skull implicated inside of what they have made as the recreation and how it matches out. He's done in a burial that shows a sand for a pillow that he's using, and he's actually facing towards the rising sun, leaving a lot of people that looked at this that the preemptive idea of the resurrection and coming back and coming forth by day, and the idea that we actually see in the Egyptian Book of the Deads was somewhat already in place at this time, some 70,000 BC. One of his arms is trapped behind his body and the other one is forward at his waist. But again, he's twisted towards the rising sun. This is known as Tal Alta Ramza child. You can look him up too and stuff and see, but he was much younger and not somebody that was in his mid to late 20s and a minor. It's just a child that's there, but there's something real conspicuous that's shown with it, and I'll try to show that to you here shortly. So it was found near Dendera, and this is the Temple of Hathor in Dendera, but it's not around that time. It's around 60,000 years after the fact. So it can't really be associated with it, but at the same time, we can see these people that were around, well, it looks like before people even left out of Africa, and during that time, and after, and all the way through. And the only phenotypes of any people that we got are a caucasoid type of people that are here. There are no Bantus or sub-Saharans or anything that are ever shown in this area. Most people know the Temple of Dendera. A lot of people know it from this artwork that's done on the ceilings, which by being there and not eroded by sand, blown by wind and so on, left it pretty much intact, very easy to see. And the pictures that you're looking at now are associated with gods, associated with stars and with the zodiac. Now the Dendera zodiac shows up much later. It's really something that's a little post of the time, and in my video about that I show how that's taken directly from a Sumerian idea, but one wonders how long that goes back. Well, I've shown cave paintings from tens of thousands of years ago that are showing they've got Taurus already in place, and in fact the Pleiades on his shoulders and everything. So there's quite a bit of astrological type things that are being done well before anything that we think about normally. So it's considered one of the oldest tombs ever found in the area that we call Egypt, or North Africa itself. There's another picture of it in situ. He was laid in his burial here at over a meter deep, and it looks like it was prepared for him. He was laid on his back, again facing towards the rising of the sun. Head resting on a sand pillow, hands extended behind his back. So again, by facing him towards the rising sun, we have reason to believe that that's what this idea was, and that they still had some essence already at this point, some 70,000 years ago, on that coming forth by day and perhaps the hopeful resurrection of a child into the afterlife. One can imagine that nowadays easily. And so we see this same thing later in the Book of the Dead, and you can look at these people on that and see they're slightly tan Caucasians running off here, whether they have animistic heads or not. So science got in the middle of this, looking at it, and it said it would have been a child between 8 to 10 years old. Now that's looking at a depiction of current Egyptian people that have a mix to them and so on, and been a little bit different than those perhaps in the time that we're talking about. And researchers found a pit of flintstones that have been worked, and it looks like they were training children in the art of being able to flint map at this time, making tools from stones, Paleolithic civilization. And these children being taught that looks like it was one of the earliest type of school environments that we find, because it looks like they took those tools and were practicing making them, and then they would throw them back into the pit. So someone had, in these mines that we're looking at, had dug a lot of stones out that were usable, and the ones that weren't just fantastic, they used for teaching, and would replace them back in the tombs. The process started with a large piece of rock, and then humans roughly shake the rock with a stone hammer, and would begin napping it, if you will, and using wood or stone or even antlers, which is real important whenever you're doing the final napping, because when you look here at the left, they're doing trimming edges and prying off tiny flakes with a pointed stick and back napping to end up leaving something like a finished hand axe. And later we can see them doing the same thing with how they built arrowheads and that knife blade that we looked at earlier, which is real thin. And so some 70,000 years ago, these people, whether we look at them as being something like this or what we try to look at that as being a truth, something like Brother Bear and inside caves and doing things like that. But the amount of people that are found in caves, due to the amount of people that we know were around at that time, and these weren't all a cave-dwelling people, but they used it for shelter quite often. And then, of course, they had to fight for it because some of these bears and cave lions and things that we looked at that are no longer existent anymore used to also want that cave. So this suggests that the children who lived 70,000 years ago at this site at Tal Amaranta were actually being taught how to flint knap and things that long ago, back in ancient times. The skills of flint tool manufacturing somewhat seasonally to smaller children, things that they would need to know in later times. And this is like the oldest form that we know of vocational training schools, especially in the area of North Africa and Egypt that we're looking at. And of course, we look at all these earliest Egyptian artifacts, and it seems like it's a somewhat continuity going from time to time here. You can see some of the different depictions that are done here. That lady in the ballerina pose, second from the left, just to the right of the lapis lazuli statue that's shown here, or perhaps the one on the right that's shown with lapis lazuli eyes in pre-proto-dynastic Egypt, that they're signifying that they had blue eyes at that time, which is really not evident in the 30,000, much less 70,000-year-old artifacts that were done here. But as soon as they got to a certain level, they definitely wanted to signify that that's who they were. And you can see it being carried on to the earliest dynasties. And if you look up blue-eyed Egyptian statues, they'll show you a lot of them that are made with these crystal blue-eyed that seem to follow you around the room. It's real impressive that it's that early in time, and one wonders why during the intermediate periods it went away basically. But one can imagine what the Greek statues would look like if they had the crystal blue eyes or other ones on the ancient Egyptians. It's pretty neat. I've shown these bowls and artifacts like this that are left behind by these people and showed you connections with them. In fact, that ballerina girl actually travels up through the Levant and up into what we know of as ancient Europe. And the same symbols are being shown. Now, they said that the domesticated cattle and the agriculture that was brought to them all together in a package, and it looks like we have a connective to who these people were that blended with the other Caucasian type, Mediterranean type people that were already there. Now, this pottery culture is even still well alive today, and you can see it being made by people on potter's wheels and so on, like Ptah, if you will. And there's a lot of these places that still sell them. And in fact, these little deals right down here remind me of the things that I've got that we put tortillas in and heat them up with a little bit of water, steam them, and preheat your tortillas for making fajitas. But this is all intricate pottery of a modern day. It's not quite done in the old way, and they're not trying to make pottery that looks like it's thousands of years old to fool somebody or to do anything along that line. But again, this pottery culture is still alive today. Have you ever seen Ghost? She's making pottery. This is something that's carried all the way through in time. Into the ancientest of cultures of Egypt, you can find things like this in the Fayum culture to the right here, shown as number 1 or the top 1. And it's got arrowheads that are shown there. Number 2 is the Merimde culture, and it had circular huts with burials along what they called a main street. And the tombs contained no offering goods at this point, and the pottery was not really decorated. This 12-centimeter long saw blade was made out of brown flint, and it's been knapped, and not double knapped, but knapped to leave a saw blade there. We can also see the Merimde culture, and where they had made a mask, which starts showing up in Canaanites not too much later. And then down here at the estimated date on that is about 5,000 to 4,200 BC. Then the Badari culture, shown towards the bottom on there on the right, and had simple clay figures and thin pottery, black-topped pottery as we know it, and the first cosmetic palettes that are shown, which all of that have to do with ancient Egypt. And they had a possible parallel culture known as the Thasian culture, which had trumpet jars, 5-centimeter high stone vases, maybe perfumed on or so on, and that dates about 4,500 to 4,000 BC. So this is pre-proto-dynastic Egypt, and it would look somewhat like this. And there's a lot of artwork that we found in that proto-dynastic times, and here you see somebody tabulating of the first of writing using ideograms on a tablet. Now when you look at that ideogram there, I question you whether that looks Sumerian or Egyptian. Well, they both turn that into cuneiform, showing you other connections during this time. A lot of these pots that are shown here are actually bread making pots, like this here and this one here, where they would take and preheat them, smear some animal fat grease around into it, and put a lop of bread inside of it, uncooked bread, dough if you will, and then by being cast in that heating thing would make little loaves of bread. How long does bread go back? Well, there's a lot of stories about bread in its earliest forms. It looks like at first we were trying to do it out of barley flour and other types, then eventually we got to the type of running it with wheat that we all know today. And of course, in Egyptian times, we can find people that are crunching out these grains and creating wheat and doing so on. And we can even find correlations where they're sacrificing cows that are here and using them for meat and so on there, of these domesticated animals. But then other depictions show doing it in a mass way. And there are even pre-proto-dynastic depictions of things that actually show similarities to this right here and this idea that we have going on. And you can see where these people are making wheat and the other people are making bread out of the bread molds and putting it in. And these are done by the thousands. So it's not something like somebody had a bread mold. It's being done in mass at certain places here, showing you that there's a whole level of civilization going on already at this point. On your far right, you can see some lady that's churning and making dough that would go into something like this. And or pottery used for cooking and so on. And again, this depiction that I show here of what they call a ballerina lady is pre-proto-Isis. She's sitting there in what looks like a ballerina pose to many, but it's also a bird pose, and she has a bird head on her, showing you connection. But why are there buzzards or vultures and stuff in there? Well, preemptive to this time, people were putting their bodies up on a dais and letting the birds eat them and take them up to the heaven. There's a lot of different ideas that go along with this and connections, but I've got a video that shows this depiction on those earliest of vases and things like that in pottery. But then there's also early cave art that's up in Europe showing this same depiction, and it looks like it went this way, of course. And in a recent video I showed a lot of these stamps that are shown here, and they're supposed to signify certain nomes of Egypt and where this product goes to, because they're doing extensive trade with the people of the Levant and even into Asia Minor, which we call Anatolia, and now we call it Turkey. So there are connections through all of that. And these are ivory made tabs, so it's not something that's just meant to be tossed away. But we can see similar depictions, as you can see here, in pre-proto-dynastic Egypt and these ideas being taught about too, in these tabs. But then there's also something strange. Here's that depiction showing a lady on a boat that has that same ballerina type pose that's on there in these huge boats. Now, the way these prows are built, a lot of people say that's like a Sumerian type thing. And you can see here they're also capturing what either looks like a bull, or an elephant, or a hippopotamus. Kind of ambiguous a little bit here, but also a man with a headdress here has a bow and arrow. One of the earliest times of it known. And there's a lot of this showing this. In fact, there's some of the things from the Red Sea and the Western Desert there that are the Eastern Desert leading between the Red Sea and the Nile itself that are showing these depictions. And a lot of people have come to the realization this is well before Egypt even got started. And they're showing these giant boats. Each little stick that's in a boat is supposed to depict a person. And if that's so, some of these hold 40 people and so on. So were they in a simple reed boat that was 10 foot long in a canoe thing? Well, they had all of that, but already at this point they've developed huge ships. Very much like the solar barks that are shown much later and everything. And right next to the Great Pyramid, they've got one that's been reassembled showing you it right there. There it is. Here it is in the Book of the Dead idea. So well before the pyramids were ever a gleam in somebody's eye and they put sacred geometry together and all the things that go into the Great Pyramids that a lot of people aren't even aware of. They just think it's a triangle sitting there as opposed to all of its connections to the size of the earth and all of these other depictions that are shown. But this is well before that. When we say 30,000 years, you have to imagine that's well below anything like that. When we look at 70,000 years, now we're looking at the time that people were supposedly going out of Africa, or the first people that survived and made it to be part of what the people are today that lived ever out of Africa. And there are a lot of depictions you can find. You could just look up this, Origins, a North African perspective of man. And you'll see that they're talking about pre-Proto-Caucasians, morphology and affinities of Nazlet Khater man, and so on. Wikipedia, and there's a bunch of links and stuff that go along with that whenever you look into it. But they say here that he is one of the earliest Homo sapiens to have been found, and these are the same early members of our species that are found from North Africa and the Levant, dated to the Middle Paleolithic, or MPHS. It includes Quasi and Sukul combinations, which are in the Holy Land, Iwo Eleru, which actually dates to 315 to 325,000 years, showing Homo sapiens, whenever, as I described before, well into and after the last ice age, there were still Homo erectus forms and more archaic forms found there, especially like, say, Western Africa below the Sahara. In fact, Asselar man is the first one that's shown with a vaulted cranium, and that's looked at as being from admix, especially when we look at their genetics, which we've been able to do finally, and you find somebody with an E1b genetics, and E1b and E and all of its constituents actually have a Eurasian connection to them, and of course all of the ancient African or North African people. And so they show connections with these people geographically in the Northwest and Northeast Africa, both the Levant, Kabaran, and Natufian specimens. In addition, we also consider a classical Neanderthal example as a non-modern contemporary group. But Neanderthal were much more advanced than any of these Homo erectus forms. In fact, the Hofmeyr skull, which is dated to 36.2 plus about 3,000 on either side, plus or minus in time, that yields information about late Pleistocene modern humans, and its cranial dimensions show stronger affinities with Eurasian Upper Paleolithic specimens rather than geographically closest recent populations. In other words, in that statement, we say we're looking at a European type people, even though it's well down into the Cape of ancient Africa. Of course, when we look at things that are 36,000 years old, we're looking at things that predate the people that you're thinking are there today. So there's close connections and similarities between the NK2 labyrinth and European Upper Paleolithic samples suggested by discriminant analysis may support a close relationship between North African specimens and European Upper Paleolithic specimens, which lead to a modern humans here. So we can see who we're talking about, although they talk in that archaic or anthropology terms. The similarities between NK2 and Upper Paleolithic European samples may indicate a close relationship between this Nile Valley specimen, this old in time. I think we're looking at the 30,000-year-old Nazlet Khater man, though, and Europeans. Let's make another connection with Europeans and Egyptians if we can right now. And though it's not politically correct now to show something like this, it's reality. For when they genetically check them, they say ancient Egyptians are more closely related to Europeans than modern Egyptians. What? Yeah, and also I've shown you before there are Nordic influence. It looks like the leaders of it were. Just like in Sumer too, when they say they rule over the dark-haired people, it makes you wonder what color hair theirs were. Well, we can find Khufu's granddaughter shown as a redhead, and knowing that it takes two to make a redhead pop out, that shows you that it's not just something that's sparse in any way. And of course, all through the dynasties, you can find red, yellow-hairs, and so on. I used to have a list of 277 different tombs that had people in it that were either blonde-haired or red-headed instead of the dark-haired form that they have there. So kind of a discontinuity, as they say it right here, between the ancient and modern populations. Well, what are the modern population more like? More like the modern Europeans. Well, can you give me an example? Well, King Tut is shown, along with Akhenaten and his family lineage here, to be R1b genetics. Now, a lot of people connect R1b and R1a with not just Nordics, but the ancient Aryans and stuff. And now we're starting to make a connection to who built the pyramids in the first place, who founded Egypt and made it all happen. It's kind of incredible. Not to put any squish upon this girl's work, I like all of it, and of course her defending her homeland from Afrocentric lies is well appreciated. Let me know what you think down below here, and I'm going to let it go at this point here. There's a couple of more things that can be shown, but I think we're done here. This is enough. 30,000 years old. 70,000 years old at the time of the people possibly leaving out of Africa even, and what was going on there. Pre-Proto-Caucasians. Peace.